Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you. This is Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. My name is Andrew Lawton. So good to have you tuned in today. It is the last podcast of 2015. I know, a very, very exciting day. In fact, if you're listening to this in 2016, well, I guess it's the first podcast of 2016. I don't know. Released on the last day of 2015, though, in any case. And one interesting aside that I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks is that Justin Trudeau, Canada's fearless leader, Canada's Prime Minister, will need to find a new catchphrase. No longer will he be able to say because it's 2015 as a justification for decisions that his government makes or his cabinet makes. No, now he'll have to either update it with because it's 2016, or he can just be more honest and candid with it and say because I want to. Because let's face it, that's the only reason he does the things that he's been doing anyway, not because of the year, contrary to what he would indeed have you believe. I actually wanted to start off talking a little bit about that very note today because I had a column in the Toronto Sun this week in which I laid out, in the spirit of giving and the spirit of openness, some New Year's resolutions for Justin Trudeau. Now, obviously, it's a novel concept. You know, most New Year's resolutions, according to research that I've seen in Canada, says that Canadians abandon them within the first day, typically. 20% of Canadians, 1 in 5 Canadians, abandon their New Year's resolutions by 24 hours after they actually made them. So maybe they aren't the best, and I think only a small handful are said to actually keep them through until the year later. And even then, I would venture a guess to say that most of them actually lied. I don't think anyone's actually making these true. But just in case, you know, a guy can dream, after all, because it's 2016, right? I figured that I was going to lay out some New Year's resolutions for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That was what I wrote about in my Sun piece. And I didn't pick anything that was a punchline. I picked serious issues, serious priorities that I don't think he would be justified in ignoring. But then again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Because even though he has just under 2 months in office under his belt, he's already had apparently some difficulty remembering the promises that he's already given to Canadians. We can look at his vow to limit deficits in Canada's budget to under $10 billion for the next few years. Well, now that deficit cap is non-existent. His government focuses more on the debt to GDP ratio. His cabinet ministers have been told, we have heard, not to even talk about the deficit cap in their messaging, and we're supposed to just sit back and hope for the best, hope that he and his finance minister, Morneau, just naturally have our best interests at heart as Canadians. So he's saying that there are going to be deficits for the next few years. I guess that'll be when the budget decides to balance itself. You know, there was this old episode of I Love Lucy. I mean, every episode of I Love Lucy is old by today's standards, where Lucy bought the giant walk-in freezer. You remember this one? She bought the giant walk-in freezer, and she told Ricky in the ad that it said, the freezer will pay for itself. And Ricky said, well, that's great. Tell it to come on over here once it's done paying for itself. And I have to think that Justin Trudeau needs a similar message. You know, if he's going to tell us to wait because the balance is going to balance itself, I'm going to say let's just wait and let the budget do that, though. Let's not you do anything until the budget balances itself. Then we'll go. So that's, I think, one of the biggest and certainly most substantive broken promises so far. He is going to have to shift some numbers around. The so-called middle class tax cut isn't having math that's adding up. It's going to leave $1 billion+ hole in the budget. And sure, you can talk about raising taxes on the wealthiest Canadians to offset it, but you still have to fill that hole somewhere. And I would much rather a reduction in spending be on the priority radar rather than balancing the budget by hiking revenue. I should be clear, when I want to balance budget, I want it balanced because of fiscal restraint being in play, not because of other things. So that's resolution number 1, to balance the budget. You know, we're going to see This so-called revenue-neutral tax cut cost us more than $1.2 billion. Any hope of deficit elimination is going to be a pipe dream. And interestingly enough, there's been a profound level of hypocrisy here in that Liberals only apparently think deficits are a bad thing when they are created by conservative governments. Oh, when the shoe's on the other foot, they're necessary for growth. It's an investment in the future. It's all about progress. Yeah, give me a friggin' break. The only thing that grows in Liberal math budgets is the national debt. The other resolution that I've laid out for Prime Minister Trudeau is to pick a new favorite premier. Right now, we're in a pretty dangerous situation in Canada where across the country, we have provinces being governed by people that don't really know what they're doing. One notable exception to this rule is Brad Wall. And not that I ever like hero worship of any politicians. The fact is, Brad Wall is a leader in the pack. When you look at people like Christy Clark, people like Rachel Notley, people like Kathleen Wynne, the fact remains we don't exactly have an inspiring lineup of premiers across Canada, all of whom were just lapdogs to the Prime Minister when he was in Paris for the UN Climate Summit. And we've seen the warm, tender embrace between Trudeau and Wynne, and we've seen the two really like birds of a feather flocking together, flocking all over the world, as a matter of fact, cavorting about carbon tax and cap and trade and talking about expanding nationalized pension plans and talking about all of these different things. And we do not, I don't anyway, get much of a positive vibe from seeing what's going to come. When two tax and spend Liberals get together, I don't imagine the outcome is going to be anything that helps people. So this is not about a personal hatred of Kathleen Wynne. This is actually about a fear of what she can and will accomplish with unchecked power. She has a majority government. Trudeau federally has a majority government. Ontario's the biggest province in Canada. Well, he needs to pick a new favorite. The premier of the largest province of the country will obviously have a good working relationship with the Prime Minister, but I think we'd be much better off, especially with where Canada's oil and energy sector is right now, not in a good place. He should align himself more with someone like Brad Wall. And Premier Wall quite recently said the government needs to, quote, do no more harm, unquote, to the resource sector. Advice like that needs to be heeded by the Prime Minister. It absolutely needs to be heeded by him. And then on the foreign policy front, we have a prime minister who thus far has proven to be an abysmal failure and extremely guilty of wishy-washiness on a very important file, which is dealing with Daesh, dealing with ISIS. And this is really concerning. Going back to in January, when I spoke to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, then the Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau, on my radio show and asked him, under what circumstances would you support combat military intervention by Canadian soldiers? And he couldn't give an answer. Terry Malevsky on CBC asked him the same question, could not give an answer. If I've shared that story with you before, there's a reason, because it's darn important. It's important to have a prime minister who in his mind can understand that sometimes there is a reason for military intervention. Sometimes there is a reason for military engagement. Sometimes, as much as we want to be pacifists, as much as we want peace, as much as we want a world in which people can hold hands and sing Kumbaya, there are realities in this world. And chief among them in the Middle East is that evil exists. Savagery exists. And I don't think it's unreasonable to want a prime minister who will take it seriously and when he decides to, knows what to do. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke and a number of other people spoke about the really impressive qualifications that Canada's defense minister, Harjit Sajjan, has. This is the man who is billed in one viral media report a badass Sikh warrior. And I still, to this day, by the way, am impressed and marveled by his qualifications, by his experience, by his aptitudes. But at the end of the day, you're putting him in a government that doesn't respect that. You're putting him in a government that doesn't really respect the integrity and abilities of soldiers in Canada. Yes, Canada is known as a nation of peacekeepers, but we are also so much more than that. And I'm looking at this man who has become Prime Minister at a pivotal point in Canada's history, at a pivotal point in the progression of the world. Weeks after taking office, more than 100 people killed by terrorism in Paris. He goes to Paris a few days later, talks about climate change as being the greatest evil in the world. And then we look at the latest news about Daesh. The latest news about this savage regime, that they actually have issued guidelines on how to best rape your sex slave. They didn't say don't do it. They said if you're going to, this is how you do it. As though there is a right way and a wrong way to rape someone. And it's a given that it's going to happen there. And this is so concerning because it's not surprising. We know this exists. We know this mentality exists. We know that girls as young as 12 years old, mostly Yazidis, are being abducted, kidnapped, raped, tortured, sold, given as rewards. Yet still, people act shocked. People act surprised. And still, the belief is that winter coats are needed more over there than a combat intervention against those who are causing this, against those who are actually abducting these young girls. In some cases, they're getting whole families, sisters, mothers and daughters, sometimes people on their own. And what was interesting about this is that this report came out. Documents were actually recovered in May, but only recently published, and I believe Reuters was the one that broke the story originally. And they were talking about this fatwa, a ruling by the Islamic State theologians, on under what circumstances you can have sex with a woman that you're holding captive. A fatwa has the force of law. And let me tell you some of the rules, and I apologize in advance if this makes you uncomfortable or makes you squeamish in any way, but people need to hear this. For example, a father and son can't have sex with the same female slave. Oh, they have to pick which one gets the rights, I guess. If you own a mother and a daughter, you can't have sex with both, you need to pick one. If you share ownership of a female captive with someone else, you are enjoined from intercourse because she's part of joint ownership. But, well, everything else is fair game. These are being sold, traded, and given as prizes to fighters, to potential martyrs. And this is not a hidden practice, by the way. The report also reveals that there is a department, I kid you not, a department of war spoils. That's a direct quote, of war spoils to manage slavery. Because they have so much of it, that they actually need a government department. They need a bureaucracy to take over it. Human Rights Watch, back in the spring, interviewed 20 females who had escaped, who spoke about this. They talked about the organized and methodical fashion in which this happened, almost Nazi-esque in the way it was organized and, despite the brutality of it, done in a very calculated way. And I'm wondering here how much we need to learn about Daesh, how much we need to learn about these savages before we start realizing that maybe this is a more imminent threat and a more serious threat and a more severe threat than the weather getting a little bit warmer. And I had written something on Twitter to that effect the other day. I wrote that, you know what? With all of this that we've learned, tell me, Justin Trudeau, how climate change is the biggest threat. And what I found shocking were the number of people that came back with these asinine claims, these asinine beliefs that, oh, people are doing this because of climate change, that erratic temperatures breeds radicalization. This is actually what people are saying. This is actually what some people are thinking. And then you get the complete nutbars that actually think this is all some grand conspiracy. I saw one guy, believe it or not, an immigration lawyer, An immigration lawyer from London, Ontario, Canada, who is also a 9/11 truther, which should tell you a fair bit there, who said that he wouldn't be surprised if this fatwa was actually planted by the Mossad. Yes, blame the Jews, blame the Israelis when something happens. And you get people that talk about ISIS being a U.S. creation, not just that resentment towards the U.S. led to the creation of ISIS, but people that genuinely believe the U.S. government is pulling the strings. I'm going to play a call for you. I don't usually do this, but this was just one that was too asinine to let pass by. And this is actually something that I was faced with on my radio show the other day when I was talking about this, talking about the fatwa, talking about this very story. And someone called in, and this is one of these situations, these rare situations, where I can't tell if I am being victimized by a practical joke of sorts. Knowing what exists in the world, I fear I wasn't. This is from the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980 in London, Ontario this week. John, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Andrew. How are you?
Afternoon, sir, but I'm doing well.
Oh, afternoon. Very good, yes. I'm listening to you talk, and I think you are doing a very big disservice to your listening audience by all this ranting that you're carrying on here. In the beginning, you said that ISIS is a banana republic at the outset of your comments, which is very appropriate because ISIS is the banana republics were creation of the United States. They put their own people in charge. They exploited the area, and they did their bidding. And that's what ISIS is. It's a creation of the United States, Israel, Britain, and their intelligence services. That's what ISIS is, and they're killing other Muslims because that's the grand design. They're destroying Syria because that's the grand design. It's nothing to do, and you're sounding all indignant, but they're carrying out a foreign policy that's
Tell me how the U.S. and Israel created ISIS.
Well, they've taken that country. They want to destroy Syria. They want to stabilize Syria. Iran, and in the end, Russia, I suppose, is their final target. So for the
No. I'm not saying why they would have. I'm saying prove that they did it. Tell me what they did and when they did it and how.
Okay, let's go back. In the last year, two British RAF planes were caught dropping supplies for ISIS. The Iraqi intelligence has caught the American military commanders corresponding with ISIS. So there's a link between these Western intelligence services and ISIS. That's the proof. It's in the public domain. Right? I read this in AP.
Just to suss this out here, because I'm familiar with the jets, and I know it was actually humanitarian aid, not military supplies, as you're talking about. But who do you think was behind 9/11?
Listen, we're talking about ISIS.
Yeah, but I'm trying to suss out what your actual agenda is. Who do you think was behind 9/11?
We are talking about ISIS now. This is why you're doing great disservice. You're trying to jumble things up.
I'm trying to actually prove that you have your tinfoil hat on too tightly. Who do you think was behind 9/11?
You're talking about ISIS.
Answer the question, John. Who was behind 9/11?
Do not give me a yes or no. This is not.
You're the one not giving me a yes or no. Here's the thing. You have people who make these moronic, asinine claims but can't even answer a simple question.
Asinine, John, or Andrew. They're not moronic. It isn't a public knowledge. These planes...
Oh, it's public knowledge now, is it? Okay, I must have missed that memo.
This was read in the AP, Associated Press, right? This is not in some alternative website. This was in the Associated Press. 2 British RAF planes were dropping supplies for ISIS. American commanders were corresponding with ISIS. The strategy is to destabilize Syria for the sake of destabilization.
See, here's the thing, though, John. Repeating the same thing doesn't make it true. You can say it over and over again, but the fact that you can't answer a simple question means that you know that by saying it, you would actually discredit the argument that you're trying to make. See, you want to go with... I said, who do you think was behind 9/11?
Why? I don't understand. What's that got to do with ISIS?
Because it proves that you are a conspiracy theory-believing whack job who has no deference to the truth. You talk about wanting to believe that, AP says this and that's true. First off, send me a link to the story and then we'll talk. Secondly, to say that ISIS is a U.S. creation, it's a myth I hear all the time. People say this all the time because they want to believe that the U.S. is the evil. It's this one world government type of nonsense. And they want to actually talk about this without actually dealing with hard and fast facts. ISIS is driven by an ideology. ISIS is driven by an ideology. It's driven by a group of people with a savage jungle mentality. Jungle mentality in the desert. Forget the geographic implications here. And what's happening is even if you were to go up to any person and say, hi, I'm the American government, I'd like to give you this much money and I'd like you to use that money to create ISIS. You have to get people that believe in that. You have to find a segment of the population that believes that the abduction, rape, torture, and murder of preteen girls is acceptable. That the kidnapping and destruction of innocent people, of historic landmarks, that this is acceptable, that this is allowable, that this is appropriate. And then you look at the fact that ISIS is actually being propped up by other foreign dictatorships governed by the same ideology. Doesn't take a genius to connect the dots. But then again, we weren't dealing with a genius. We were dealing with John. Thanks for the call, John. Now, thankfully, people like him are in the minority. I certainly hope. I don't want to commit to that too heavily. But the reason I asked about 9/11, by the way, because it wasn't technically related, and he was right when he said, "Oh, that's not what we're talking about here." The reason I ask about that is because I think it's important to really identify where someone is coming from. Identify what someone's approach to this is. Because what I found typically is that conspiracy theorists who believe in one particular thing often believe in every conspiracy theory. And underscoring them all generally is some form of anti-Semitism. It's very bizarre. A lot of them love Russia. I don't know why, but the love of Russia seems to be underscoring this in a lot of cases. And I'm sure in most cases you can probably go back and find some semblance of Holocaust denial in a lot of different people anyway. This story that he touted, I hadn't heard. I thought I had heard of one that he was talking about. And then when he kept going on and on, I realized I have no idea what this guy's talking about. I looked it up. Nowhere in the Associated Press archives does it exist, but some independent report from some guy in Iraq, from the Iraqi agency that wasn't even like the official Iraqi news agency, and then that was picked up, and not a single verifying report confirming that has been found. Now, that doesn't mean that, with my distrust of mainstream media, inherently that anything's wrong, but if you're going to lie, and say that this was actually written and published in a mainstream publication, well, you better darn well be able to back that up. And the reason I share that with you, in addition to the fact that, well, first off, it's fun, is that there are people out there that are in utter and complete denial about ISIS. Now, what's different from John and Justin Trudeau? Well, Justin Trudeau doesn't deny that this stuff is happening. Justin Trudeau doesn't deny that there is evil in that part of the world. But both of them seem to support doing the same thing to stop it, which is absolutely nothing. And it's quite scary when the response by a conspiracy theorist in their mind would be identical to the response by the head of government. Basically, let other countries do the heavy lifting. That's been Justin Trudeau's policy. The schoolyard bully is ISIS. Justin Trudeau wants to be the little Swiss kid that says, let someone else deal with it. And he has the gall to say the Canadians are better than combat. To me, there is very little that is morally superior to a soldier who is prepared to take up arms and risk their own life for their country. That is a reality that we cannot escape, nor can we avoid. But he seems to be doing both of those things, at least in his own mind. So how do we respond to it? How do we deal with it? Well, for starters, he's there. He's the Prime Minister. He's the one tasked with making this work. That was why I included defeating Daesh on this New Year's resolutions for Justin Trudeau list, because you know what? 2016 is a new year. You flip over a new page. Maybe, just maybe, we can hope for the best. But if Paris didn't galvanize action, if Michael Zehoff-Bibo, who maybe not working for ISIS, but certainly inspired by them, attacks Canada last year, and that doesn't inspire a response, I don't know what will. And I never like to be overly dramatic by saying that someone hates Canada. I don't believe he hates Canada. I believe he's weak, however. And I remember going back to the time that Barack Obama was initially inaugurated, the New York Times was asking a bunch of people to write, I think 400 words was what it was, 400 words on what they wanted him to do or what they thought would happen or what they thought he would do and all that sort of stuff. And Rush Limbaugh famously said, "I just need 4 words." And those 4 words were, "I hope he fails." And this was actually somewhat of a point of controversy for many conservatives, going back to 2009 it would have been actually, because a lot of conservatives were saying, whoa, do we actually want to wish failure on the President of America? Because if he fails, America fails. And Rush Limbaugh, love him or hate him, had a really reasonable response to that. He basically said, you know what? What are we accomplishing as conservatives if we allow these ideas to succeed? If we allow Justin Trudeau now, or Barack Obama then, if we allow those ideas to succeed, ideas rooted in socialism, to look at Trudeau in a global warming alarmism, in a fundamental belief and a fundamental set of values that is so at odds with the values of liberty, with the values of patriotism, with the values of self-sufficiency as a nation. Why would we ever want to celebrate that? Why would we ever want that to be even remotely successful? It's a worthwhile question, definitely. And I would go out on a limb to say that most people, and I don't think this is limited to either the left or the right, most people don't have a personal hatred towards leaders, typically. But I also think that Stephen Harper was a turning point for a lot of people. The hatred was personal. You know, Tristan Hopper in the National Post had a really interesting piece last week, and he was talking about people who have run into Stephen Harper. One person ran into him in Vegas, and they talked about hockey, and one person ran into him at a bookstore, and one person ran into him walking down the sidewalk in his Calgary neighborhood, and people were basically just sharing this story because it was interesting. We don't necessarily think about what happens to a leader when they leave office, especially in Canada, which is really a fade into obscurity. And I shared this on my own Facebook page as well because it was an interesting piece, and I would have been interested in any leaders transition back to civilian life. And my goodness, the response that people had, even though Stephen Harper's gone, Trudeau won, change of government, he's got a majority, Harper's out of the picture, people were still talking about a couple of people wanting to boycott the National Post for publishing such swill, saying, how dare anyone write a story that makes Stephen Harper look kind? And they said, well, there's no way he is. And I was like, I've met him probably a dozen times, maybe more, I don't know. Interviewed him 3 times, never been anything but unkind. So for anyone to say, based on, stuff they've heard in the media or want to believe that he has to be this evil, terrible man, it is, as it was known very effectively, Harper derangement syndrome. Seems to only really apply to conservatives, which is the most unique part of it. So fundamentally, I want Canada to succeed, but do I believe it can happen under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? Absolutely not. The Vogue spreads only go so far. The Vogue spreads only accomplish so much. International exposure, people sharing shirtless pictures of Justin Trudeau, the selfies, the photo ops at the airport, these things only go so far before we realize, as Brian Lilly said just a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact, the emperor is wearing no clothes. You can't evade accountability forever. And we've seen the media, inevitably, which doesn't seem to have gotten the memo. Donna Friesen from Global made Justin Trudeau, or gave him anyway, a friggin' cake, for crying out loud. I don't know how that is at all in any journalistic ethics book, that you can give a prime minister a cake and still expect to actually hold that person accountable. We had Peter Mansbridge officiating the wedding of Justin Trudeau's Director of Communications, Kate Purchase, and thank goodness for Jesse Brown at Canadaland for even making that known. And again, we're supposed to believe that this media, which people sometimes mock Ezra Levant for calling it the media party, but how can you say it's not? Actually, I can. It's not a party. It's not a party because, let's face it, a party would be actually trying to work against the government. It's just the unofficial communications branch of the Liberal Party of Canada. That seems to be a far more apt way of describing things. And again, I'm not here to shatter your dreams, to shatter your goals. I'm here to uplift and inspire, right? Said with tongue planted firmly in cheek. But don't think that me, as the unofficial leader of the unofficial opposition, is going to let up. I'm not. I am not going to let up, nor will the Rebel, nor will another smattering of voices that exist across this country, because let's face it, the stakes are just too darn high. When we come back, we will have more of Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back in just a moment. I'm Andrew Lawton.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. I always try every show to come up with new content. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't themes that emerge, and that doesn't mean we don't revisit things, but I always try to keep things fresh. You know what? With a weekly show, you always have a lot of different events that have happened from which I can choose as a host and, well, I mean, quite frankly, as a producer as well. But this is going to be one where I break with that rule because I think that it's important enough and timely enough that the issue warrants a revisitation and the guest warrants a revisitation. Apart from Mark Stein, who's been on the show like 4 times, I don't think we've done any repeats yet. Maybe we've had a couple of the fellow Rebels on. In any case, one issue that has really dominated, and I to me, don't know why people care as much. They should. It just surprises me that they do, is the question of democratic reform. Specifically electoral reform and how such a reform should take place. Now, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Harrison Ruess, who is basically one of the architects of DefendDemocracy.ca, a petition demanding a referendum before any democratic changes or electoral changes are put into place. And that interview was wonderful. Lots of people had some very positive things to say about it. But what has happened now is the Liberals have switched from their position of ambivalence and ambiguity to now saying, nope, no referendum. Well, Harrison and his group are not letting up just yet, so I'm very pleased to welcome, to respond to this, Harrison Ruess of DefendDemocracy.ca. Back to the program. Harrison, thanks for your time today.
Good to be here.
We had Harrison on a couple of weeks ago to talk about the referendum DefendDemocracy.ca is pushing for, which is basically not a sentiment one way or another about what a voting reform should look like in Canada or whether we have one, but rather whether or not Canadians should be directly weighing in on the discussion. Now, one interesting, I guess, aside to this has been that the Conservative Party has also really been promoting this a referendum idea. The Liberals have said up until the last couple of days that, well, you know, they haven't decided one way or another what's happening. Now, Liberal House Leader Dominic LeBlanc has said that the plan is to not have a national referendum, but rather to use Parliament to consult Canadians. So basically, ruling it out, at least for the time being. Did this surprise you, Harrison, or were you expecting that they might actually cave and decide that, hey, maybe a referendum isn't a bad idea?
I'm not terribly surprised that so far they have not changed their tune, and Mr. LeBlanc was on television on the Sunday of holiday weekend and talking about the Liberal plan to not give Canadians a direct say. I suspect that they're still trying to figure out a way if they can push through an electoral reform package without having a referendum. I'm hopeful that they'll come to the conclusion that if we want our democratic system to have legitimacy, and if we want any reform packages to have legitimacy, the Canadians must have a chance to weigh in directly. And the only way that you can do that, as you mentioned, is through a referendum. What the Liberals said yesterday is that they're going to use their parliamentary committee to consult with Canadians, but that doesn't really mean much because every government that passes any law, well, all those bills go to all party committees, and the committees listen to people, and then the government tends to pass the law that they wanted to pass in the first place, because that's what governments and political parties do. So this notion of an all-party committee consulting with Canadians, I think, is a lot of window dressing to something that really will amount to simply the status quo and the government putting forward a piece of legislation that could potentially benefit them a lot more than other political parties. And I don't think that's a particularly fair way to go about electoral reform in a democratic country such as Canada.
Yeah, and it's a particularly interesting one as well, because as you mentioned here, I mean, a consultation with Canadians is, I would assume, in a perhaps overly idealistic way, that existed around every legislation. I mean, MPs always say they want to hear from Canadians. Whether or not that changes the way they vote one way or another is secondary. That is always there. So I'm not sure how they're saying that's any different from every single decision that an MP already makes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major issues here is that, the government is talking about it being an all-party committee. But, of course, all committees are all-party committees, and the government, being a majority government, holds a majority on all the committees. That's the nature of how our democracy works. And I don't think that there's necessarily a problem in that, because they did win a majority government and they do have a mandate to govern. But when we're talking about changing how our democracy fundamentally works, that is, how we hold our politicians to account, I think you require a higher standard to have that sort of bill become law. And I support their process. I think that they should have the committee. The committee should talk about electoral reform. They should genuinely talk to as many Canadians as they can. There should be a vigorous debate in the House of Commons and in the Senate. And the bill should be passed. However, there should be a stipulation in it that before any reform package becomes law, Canadians get a vote directly. Because if we change how our democratic system works, then Canadians could potentially lose the ability to hold governments to account. Because ordinarily, if a government passes a budget that you don't like or a few budgets that you don't like, well, in a couple years there will be an election and you can throw the bums out, as people like to say. But if the bums change how our democracy works, without Canadians getting a say, well, perhaps we will not have the ability to throw the bums out down the road. And so that's why it's vitally important that there be a stopgap measure here where Canadians get to have a say directly. And I think it's important to underscore as well that whether you're in favor of reform or opposed to reform, or you favor some kinds of reform but not other kinds of, because there's myriad of options before us here in terms of how the electoral system could work. It's the most fundamental issue here is that Canadian democracy has legitimacy, that all Canadians can say, yes, this is a system that everybody has bought in, that there's no perception that one party is trying to pull the wool over others or try to cheat in subsequent elections. It's vitally important that whatever party you're a part of, whatever electoral reform system you're in favor of, that the reform package is passed by Canadians, because that is the only way that it will then have legitimacy in subsequent elections. Because if a political party can just change the electoral system, well, what happens when the next political party gets in power and then they want to change the electoral system? And after that, and after that. And so the bar has to be set at the highest possible level to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and it's like we saw back in the U.S. was sort of the original form of gerrymandering, as it's now known, redrawing electoral boundaries to benefit certain people. And ultimately, I mean, any change to the election system is something that could be very, very easily defined and designed to help the status quo or to help who's already there. So I guess one thing that I wanted to bring up with you, though, because a lot of criticisms have been that, people are elected in Parliament to make decisions. Which types of changes should be subject to a referendum? In your eyes, should we be employing these on a lot of big items, or is it just for changes in the voting system specifically that you think that's a form of decision-making that should be embraced?
Well, I'm not somebody who advocates referendums every 6 months on every issue before us. We live in a representative democracy. I support us living in a representative democracy. We elect politicians to go to make decisions for us in Ottawa. I have no issue with that system. But I think where you do have to draw a line is that if we're going to change how the system fundamentally works, that's not something that our representatives can do. The decisions about how our representatives get there can't be left to the representatives. The people have to decide that directly themselves. And so I think our representatives, our MPs, can come up with a reform package, a proposal. I think they should do that work. They should meet their 18-month timeline that the government has set out. But there simply has to be that step in there where Canadians get the final say on whether or not that comes to be.
One interesting aside to that has been that we heard Nathan Collin last week, the NDP member of Parliament, say that we should be, instead of looking at a referendum before any change is made, look at a referendum after the fact. He said, let's change the system, and then a couple of elections later, let Canadians decide if we want to keep it or not. What would be your response to an idea like that, which, well, certainly it seems imperfect, is better than what the Liberals seem to be pledging to move forward with now, which is no direct voice to Canadians on the matter?
Well, I suppose that it is, as you say, it's better than nothing. But since no reforms have happened yet, I don't know why we should be aiming to have the bar low. Why not set the bar high? Why not get the system right from the first place? And why not have Canadians buy in the first place? And, I mean, who's to say, have a government commit, we'll hold a referendum, 15 years from now. I don't know that I would ever hold my breath that something like that could come to pass. So, if the government does come up with a reform package, and if electoral reform is as important and popular as people like to say that it is, then surely a referendum with a good, strong reform package put together behind it, surely that referendum would pass. So I'm not sure the origin of why people who are in favor of reform, I'm not sure why so many of them are either nervous or fearful or unwilling to embrace the idea of a referendum. Because if reform is as popular as people suggest that it is, then surely a referendum would pass without difficulty. But to say that, because a referendum might not pass democratically, well, therefore we should skip democracy, I don't think that's a particularly compelling argument in Canada.
You're right, and I think that when we are looking at any sort of change, aiming high should always be our goal as a country. And one point that I raised earlier on in the program was that, Canadians voted for Justin Trudeau in part because he was promising change of some kind, but we didn't give him a mandate to change anything carte blanche. And I think that for my perspective on this anyway is that if he had been elected and one of his big pledges was we want to change the system to this so it looks this way, I would have a lot more sympathy for Parliament making the decision. But given that there was no concrete vision actually put forward, I'm not sure that really works because Canadians, and obviously we know it was not a majority of Canadians given how our system works, but Canadians did vote for Trudeau, but not for any specific vision that he laid out on this.
No, I think that's certainly true, and I mean, people sometimes like to say that, well, the election was a referendum on electoral reform, and because the Liberals won, therefore electoral reform happens. Well, if we're going to count that as the referendum, the Liberals got 39% of the vote. That is not a passing grade in a referendum, and so I think it's significant to remember that yes, they do have a mandate to govern, but they have a mandate to govern within Canada, within how our system works. If they want to fundamentally change how the democracy in our country works, I think that you need a stronger mandate than 39% of the people. And indeed, that's one of the valid arguments against our electoral system, is that you give 100% of the power to a party that only wins 39% of the vote. But if you think that's not a valid, not a legitimate democratic system, how can you then at the same time argue that, well, they have an illegitimate mandate, but they can legitimately change the electoral system?
Yeah,
Again,
it's even worse to give the power, 100% power to 338 people.
Yeah, well, and that's it exactly. So, I think it's important to say that I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be electoral reform. I'm simply arguing very strongly that for that reform to have legitimacy, Canadians must have the final say on whether or not it comes to be. We can't leave that power to one political party, which has a clear vested interest in the outcome of the electoral reform.
So if a referendum were to be embraced, after all, it's never too late to change the course of this, what do you think a good threshold would be for any sort of electoral change?
I think that based on how provinces have done it, because of course electoral reform referendum isn't a new idea or isn't an unusual thing. Provinces in Canada have done it a number of times. BC's had two. Ontario had one. About 6 or 7 years ago now? PEI had one. In most cases, it was simply a 50% plus one majority. BC did have one that was a 60% plus one. But I think 50% plus one is fine, perhaps, though, with the added condition that it has to be from 50% of the provinces or something like that. So you don't just get Ontario and Quebec imposing something on the rest of the country. So you have 50% plus one of the population, and 50% plus one of the provinces, or something like that. So you get some sort of regional balance to make sure that it is something that truly all Canadians from across the country embrace.
Well, time will tell on this. Very pleased to be joined by Harrison Ruess of DefendDemocracy.ca, a website with a petition that anyone can go and sign, despite the comment made this weekend by Dominic LeBlanc. It's never too late for Canadians to weigh in and for perhaps a change in the direction there. Harrison, really appreciate the time.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
I've said time and time again that I'm not a believer in direct democratic legislation like voter recall. I don't like term limits. I don't like anything that takes power away from the decision that the voters have made, and I don't like anything that also makes legislation have to follow such a convoluted and complicated path. But when you're talking about changing the way voting works, that is the one area above all else where it seems to be so clear, so abundantly clear that the voters should get to weigh in directly. I don't know why that is apparently a source of controversy. I don't know why that is not just a given, especially for a government that claims that it's coming after a government that lacked transparency, a government that lacked accountability. Why are they scared of what the voters want to do? Because the Liberals know that they can rig the system in their favor. It's that simple. More Lawton Online when we come back in just a couple of moments here, folks. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
This is Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Thanks for sticking with me through the break there. Well, sometimes I just sit back and wonder. I wonder, and I ponder, and I muse, and I speculate how something could be real. How could someone be as, frankly, stupid? Not that I wouldn't love to use a more pretentious word to accomplish the same aim. How could anyone go down this road? Well, that happened to me this week when I read the story of a student in Windsor, a high school student, who, for some reason, does not understand what racism really is, but thinks that he has been a victim of it. The story comes down to a Windsor student, 17 years old, from Holy Names Catholic High School, which is a public school. It's a Catholic school, but publicly funded school. His name is Awab Abdullahi. He's black, presumably Muslim, based on the name, or from a Muslim background. And he is considering and actually taking his school through the human rights tribunals because of its racism against him. He's been backed by a lawyer in London, Ontario, my city. He also has the backing of the University of Windsor's Black Student Alliance, even though he doesn't go to the University of Windsor. All because of a tweet. That was how this began. A tweet that he posted on his personal Twitter account. Now, I'm going to read the tweet in its entirety. And some people may get up in arms about the language. I'm doing it to illustrate the point here. He wrote, quote, "Word this nigga gonna shoot up this school," unquote. Word this nigga gonna shoot up this school, unquote. Now, I speak the English language, I think, with a reasonable level of ability, and I don't know what he's saying. I don't know if he's talking about himself. I don't know if he's talking about another person. I don't know if he's using the N-word just as a somebody or if he's using it to describe someone who's black. Is he using it to describe himself? I don't know. But what jumps out to me about that is gonna shoot up this school. That tells me, you know what, with all of the school violence we've heard of and have had to become more sensitive to, strikes me as a key phrase in there that shouldn't be overlooked. Well, it wasn't. It became a subject that the school itself had to deal with, school administrators had to deal with it, and indeed Windsor police had to deal with it. Awab Abdullahi was arrested. He was questioned. The school suspended him for 20 days, and it was because of this tweet. Now, he maintains he wasn't talking about himself. He says he was talking about someone else, talking about a rumor that he had heard, talking about a YouTube video that he saw. Said that he wasn't actually threatening the school, and it's offensive that they punished him just because he was black. That's what he said. He said he was unfairly targeted. His lawyer, Lawton Afolabi, says that somebody else threatened to shoot up the school and rape a teacher, and he was tweeting about it. His sister says the tweet can't be taken as a threat. This is her exact quote. The tweet can't be taken as a threat. You can't talk about yourself in the third person. Well, Andrew thinks he can. It sounds stupid. It makes me sound like a total jackass. But yes, I can in fact do it. Now, the Windsor Essex Catholic District School Board and the Windsor Police Service won't talk about the specific case. He wasn't actually charged with anything, but a school board spokesperson did talk about the need to have proper use of social media because, let's face it, anything you say can trigger a strong reaction. That was what they said. And a statement from Stephen Fields of the board said, quote, "In today's climate where mass shootings have become a regular occurrence, students need to know that any threats that suggest such violence are going to be taken extremely seriously. Whether perceived or real, that creates an injurious disruption to the school climate which will be taken very seriously, and there will be consequences." And apparently it was police that notified the school, not the other way around. So someone probably called police because they were a little bit concerned, or it triggered a couple of maybe keyword searches the police had, like, for example, shoot up this school. Again, strikes me as something that we might want to pay attention to. Now, forgetting the fact for a moment that if the school did not respond to this, the police did not respond, and heaven forbid something actually happened, there would be hell to pay. There would be multi-million-dollar lawsuits. People would be looking at the school saying, why did you not act? You knew this was going to happen. Why did you not step in? And furthermore, they'd be right to criticize them, because that would be inexcusable and unconscionable if you let something like that happen when you had a threat. Now, people can say that a lot of people just mouth off and you never know what someone means. I'd rather err on the side of caution. That doesn't mean locking everyone up. That doesn't mean overreacting, but it means vetting and investigating. So that's why the school had to do what it was going to do. The suspension, I don't know what the social media policies are. I understand there may be an issue with having rules that affect someone on their own time and what they say on their own personal account. But his defense has nothing to do with, I wrote this on my own time, and this didn't have to do with my time at school, and you can't suspend me for something I do on my own. This defense that he's leveling has everything to do with him believing that he's a victim of racism. That a black student with a Muslim-sounding name who makes a comment that ambiguously alludes to a potential school shooting is worried that he might have had his precious human rights trampled upon. You can't make up this kind of idiocy. So now the Black Student Alliance, why the University of Windsor needs a Black Student Alliance and why they need to get involved in a domestic issue at a high school, I do not understand. But Loba Afolabi, the brother of this boy's lawyer, has weighed in here. They wrote a letter to the school talking about unequal treatment devoted at Abdullahi just because he's black. They said that a white student who posted a YouTube video that had similar language received a shorter suspension than Abdullahi, but the school has said that that video had nothing to do with the actual tweet. And for starters, a 20-day suspension really isn't that big a deal. You weren't charged. You certainly learned your lesson. And if you are concerned about an actual threat facing your school, I'm not sure that a tweet that invokes the N-word is really the way you warn people about it. Maybe you contact the school. Maybe you contact police. This is a grade 12 student, by the way. I mean, he's going to be in university or college next year. These are the types of people that we're basically bringing into adulthood in a very short order. So the fact that there is any semblance of racism here, or the fact that that is an accusation or an allegation, is, in the words of the school board spokesperson, offensive. I don't think it's all that surprising, though. This is the standard garden variety race baiting that we've come to learn is essentially a standard and accepted knee-jerk reaction to any situation. On the flowchart of grievances, if anything happens to you and you are a minority, it doesn't even matter what the motivation was. You're able to check off that box and say, oh, wait, I was oppressed. It's like that old Monty Python sketch. I'm being repressed. I'm being repressed. Now you say, I'm being oppressed. I'm being oppressed. I'm being targeted. I'm being targeted. And thank goodness we have these wonderful kangaroo courts known as the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario and its counterparts in other provinces to deal with such horrific hardship. You know, I see a lot of really dumb comments. And we can go back to Ahmed the Clock Boy in Texas, I think it was, or in I think it was Texas. Ahmed the Clock Boy. And the more we learned about that story, the more it made sense why the school responded the way it did. And I also think that in that particular case, we were sweeping to judgment, not because it had to do with a Muslim high school student, but in a lot of cases because it had to do with schools, generally speaking, overreacting to potential threats. The fact is, threats do exist. And while I thought that the reaction to Ahmed the Clockmaker was a little bit overzealous, I understood why it happened. And I ended up saying that I didn't think that was an issue of racism. I thought that was an issue of schools being so hypersensitive and really penalizing ingenuity. That's what I thought that case really came down to. There's no ingenuity to tweeting about a nigga that's going to shoot the school up. Sorry, Awa, but there's no defense of that. It's not like you can talk about your future as a would-be engineer, and that's why you crafted that tweet. No, you were being a moron. And to claim that you're a victim when you may have been responsible for people who were quite possibly very scared about what was happening, or what could have happened, or a threat that may or may not have existed, yeah, I really don't buy it. Really do not buy it whatsoever. So when we look at the history of the year, when we look at the 2015 in review here, this has to be one of the biggest trends that we're seeing that is certainly taking hold more this year than it has in previous years. And who knows, maybe 2016 will be better, but let's face it, it won't. It'll only get worse. Everyone's a victim. You know, some people follow Chinese zodiacs. You've got like the year of the dragon. You've got the year of the snake. You've got the year of the pig. And I mean, this is the year of the victim. 2015, the year of the victim. 2016, probably going to be the year of the victim still. Anyone born from this point on, the Chinese zodiac sign will be victim. Because you know what? That is what we were grooming generations of right now. As we speak, it's happening. And you don't really need to be a victim of anything in particular. You can just be a victim of something. It's the same as when we talk about university and their codification of microaggressions. A microaggression, an alleged aggression that takes place regardless of the motivation of the person who is the aggressor. You just have to claim that someone aggressed against you, if you will, to make up some verbs here. And that's it. That your feelings trump someone else's right to free speech. That's what the microaggression and political correctness culture says. And in this case, Abdullahi says that your freedom is secondary to his freedom from offense. Your safety and security as a student at a Catholic school is secondary to his freedom from discrimination. His freedom from feeling offended, from feeling hurt, from feeling targeted, from feeling like a victim of racism. You know, we have the case that we really saw inflaming this week of Tamara Rice, the 12-year-old who was killed, and police not laying charges. You know, there is no right and wrong when you're dealing with cases like this. There is actually a right and wrong, but people don't see a right and wrong. People just see pain and hurt and anger and emotion. People don't see with any sense of clarity there. Was Tamara Rice the victim of racism? I can't speak to the officer. I think we have problems in policing. I don't think that that is indicative of the majority. But in that case, you can understand that there's a real victim there. You can have the discussion. There's someone who was actually victimized, a 12-year-old boy. Whether intentionally or unintentionally is another discussion altogether. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm injecting any opinion into this, because I really don't know the case well enough to take one side on it. And I actually want to touch on that a bit next week. But when you compare that to this, there's no victim in this case. There's a mildly inconvenienced 17-year-old that thinks everybody else is out to get him just because he doesn't know how to use Twitter. And for the love of all that is good, learn to speak real English. You're 17. I'm sure you can string together a couple of better sentences, and maybe your intentions will be in the future a little bit more clearly stated. The time has come to wrap up this program for the year. Now, I know I haven't actually been doing the podcast for a full year. The Rebel launched somewhat, I think it was last winter. It might have been last spring. I can't remember the exact month and when the seasons change over. I know Sun News Network closed last February, but I will say that the part of the year that I've been with you has been absolutely wonderful. Lots of great things planned for the months and certainly the year to come, and I hope you will continue to tune in. It's been an absolute blast, so thank you for all who have listened in since the start, for all who have joined at some point on the way, and for all who've stopped listening, well, tough luck. You're missing out on some great stuff. Folks, my name is Andrew Lawton, signing off for one final time in 2015, because it's, 2015. I can say it one more time. Thank you very much. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Have a great year, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.